Okay, so now we get going with Roman numeral 3. We were at Roman numeral 3, letter B. We'd already done Cherokee v. Georgia, and if you need further explanation on that, ask me on Monday. But in any case, where we pick up then is with Roman numeral B. Now, the general strategy that the U.S. government had towards the Native Americans is basically to take their land and instead move them so they could have their own lands. The logic being that this would be essentially keeping with the spirit of the agreement, if not the letter of the law. So in other words, the Indians could have their own land separate from the United States. It just would be not their own land. We would choose the land for them. This land was often referred to as reservations. Now, these reservations were basically land set aside for Native Americans that they could run pretty much like their own little sovereign state or their own little sovereign country. And this is still true today. Most of the tribes still have their little reservations. And on the reservations, the tribes can make their own laws and government as long as they aren't violating U.S. law. This is why, like, the stereotype of the Indian casino exists, because on the land they can make legalized gambling even if the state doesn't allow it, because the U.S. government is fine with it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So these reservations were spread out throughout the western United States, the western and midwestern United States, mostly in areas we didn't care about. For example, the Black Hills. The Black Hills were up in the Dakota region, and basically, again, it was sort of the junk land that we weren't that interested in. And then we found gold. On a lot of these reservations, we chose this land again because it was land we didn't want. But then, after some effort and discovery, the Native Americans discovered things like oil and gold on some of these land. And as a result, it creates this phenomenon where we basically look at the Native Americans and say, hey, we'd like that back. If we could, we'd like that land that we gave you back now, take backies. And of course, the Native Americans were less than interested in giving it back, since after all, they'd already been kicked off their land once. When we come back to them and say, we're going to take your land back, most of them react very badly. This starts a cycle of what are referred to as the Indian Wars. But calling them Indian Wars is kind of overstating it and a little bit of a misnomer, because when you think war, you think two even sides going head to head fighting it out. The Indian Wars were more like a cycle of revenge and counter-revenge. We would do something, the Indians would respond, then we'd respond to that, then they'd respond to that, and so on and so forth. Like, we'd build a railroad through an Indian reservation, so they'd come out at night and rip up the railroad, so we'd put them in jail, so they'd break out of jail, so we'd hunt them down, so they'd shoot back, and so on and so forth. Take, for example, Little Bighorn / Wounded Knee. The Battle of Little Bighorn was basically the U.S. Army was sent to go chase down a group of Native Americans, but they underestimated the Native Americans and were slaughtered. The Battle of Little Bighorn is most famous as Custer's Last Stand, if you've ever heard of it. General Armstrong, George Armstrong Custer, I want to say? Custer is his last name. First name, I want to go with George. In any case, Custer went out there, cocky as all get out, left his big guns behind, and he's saying, they're Native Americans, we can take them. And he and his men get roundly slaughtered. When Custer gets killed, everyone freaks out because, oh my gosh, these Native Americans killed all these army men. So in revenge, the army gathered up a group of Native Americans at Wounded Knee and basically massacred them. What's often referred to as the Battle of Wounded Knee is not really a battle. What had happened was the army, in retaliation, captured a whole group of Indians. Someone's gun went off. The army overreacted and opened fire on a group of Indians, including women and children. Now, they again claim that someone in the crowd opened fire. The Indians claim that, no, that was the army who opened fire first. Either way, it's this, again, cycle of revenge, counter-revenge. The Indians, kill a group of army men, so the army gather up a group of Indians and blow them away. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this cycle continues until Native American leaders like Chief Joseph basically put their foot down. Chief Joseph was a leader of I'm going to go with Nez Perce tribe off the top of my head. Not terribly important. He was a major leader in the Indian movement, and basically Chief Joseph is the one who calls for peace between both sides. To the Indians, he basically says, we can't win this. All of our young men are dead or in jail. We're never going to be able to topple the U.S. Army. Let's just make do with what we have. And to the army, he basically said, does it make you guys feel good that you're beating up on women and children? You're beating up on the sick and the elderly here? Come on, you can just let us have our land, can't you? His famous quote was, from where the sun now stands, I shall fight no more forever. And this phrase basically becomes sort of a rallying cry, the idea of the Native Americans being that, we're done, we're tired of this, and it did successfully sort of shame the U.S. government into, well, letting them live. As a result, the Army backed off of their plan and didn't relocate everybody, instead relocated some of them, gave them more rights in their reservations and so forth. And that's sort of where you ended up today, is that the Native Americans were repopulated and reorganized onto their reservations. Which brings us into letter C, modern issues. As I said, the Native Americans, in terms of modern issues, the Native Americans were placed in reservations where they basically have their own laws and can do whatever they want. However, in general, the Native Americans as a minority group have generally sort of a poor outlook. Have higher rates of poverty, have higher rates of disease, have higher rates of death than almost every other minority group. This is because, unfortunately, the Native American community largely got, for lack of a better word, the short end of the stick when it came to things. The U.S. government tended to treat them much worse than a lot of the other minority groups. Take, for example, Richard Pratt and the Carlisle Indian School. This is sort of emblematic of the entire attitude towards Native Americans. Richard Pratt was a reformer and a preacher, a missionary, who came out west in the 1800s, hoping to help out the Native Americans. He founded a number of schools for the Native Americans on the reservations, most famous of which was the Carlisle Indian School. Now, on the surface, this seems like a good thing, but the problem is when you look at his strategy. The Carlisle Indian School, their slogan was, "Kill the Indian to save the man." So the idea was that they're going to save the Indians, quote unquote, by teaching them how to be white. At these schools, for example, Native Americans were beaten if they used their native tongues rather than English. They were hit if they wore anything other than, standard shirt and tie. And so generally, again, Native Americans were getting an education, but they were getting an education at the cost of their culture and their livelihoods and so forth. This is emblematic, like in the 70s, for example, the U.S. government gave the Native Americans jobs burying nuclear waste on their reservations because we didn't want it, so we gave it to them. And we paid them for it, and of course they all got cancer, and we all went, that's interesting, let's write that down. So unfortunately, the Native American community is, again, generally not that well off, and is a very, very sore spot because the theory is that the reservations still have laws and agreements with the U.S. government, but the U.S. government isn't all that interested in honoring them. There was a big to-do, for example, a couple of years ago in New York when they tried to build a highway through an Indian reservation, and the Indians said, "You can't do that," and the government said, "Watch us." And so the spirit of Cherokee v. Georgia is still there, that whole attitude of, there are laws, but frankly, we don't care. And that's sort of, again, the problem that the Native Americans generally face. Okay. That's Roman numeral 3, and click on to the next video, and we'll do Roman numeral 4, which has to do with Hispanic Americans.